Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I'm Christine Weidig. I'm the Director of Environmental and Energy Programs for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Welcome to the World Trade Center. Hopefully no one had too much confusion with the venue change, but if you haven't already walked across the plaza, I definitely encourage you to take a little time after the event to do so. The Port Authority is really proud of what we've rebuilt here, and we have some stunning architecture, as you could see around you, and some new street art installations, and I think it's really worth checking out. So I'm going to open things up with a few words of background about the Port Authority, who we are, and why we've brought all of you here today. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey builds, operates, and maintains critical transportation infrastructure in New York and New Jersey. That includes 5 airports, 6 bridges and tunnels, seaports, rail, bus facilities, and we really are vital to keeping the economy of the region moving. And as part of our mission, we've set as a priority environmental sustainability. We adopted an 80% by 2050 greenhouse gas reduction goal. We've developed programs around that to reduce not only direct Port Authority emissions, but emissions arising from users of our facilities. And as you can probably imagine, when we talk about users of our facilities, that includes aircraft, ocean-going vessels, short-haul trucking, global courier delivery services, and all of the specialized equipment that supports some of those operations. And while the Port Authority is making an aggressive push towards electrification of our airport buses and our light-duty vehicle fleet, I'm sure you are well aware of the fact that some of the transportation modes I just mentioned are really not available in electric models in the near future, or at least at scale. And so what we've tried to do is enhance our collaboration with our stakeholders and with our partners to really take on that challenge of decarbonizing the heavy transportation sector. So we're really, really delighted that you've all joined us here for this dialogue today. We have a really diverse audience. So we have people from government, we have financial institutions, academia, also some of our partner businesses and other people representing industry and energy companies. And so I really welcome you to participate in this dialogue. And with that, I think one, word of housekeeping, we'll do questions at the end. So if you don't mind holding your questions until then, we've left ample time for Q&A and also a little more time for networking if you didn't already get a chance to meet each other. So with that, we'll ask our distinguished panel of experts to introduce themselves, starting with Robert Baldwin.
Hi, good morning. My name is Bob Baldwin. I'm currently at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, where I have the title of Principal Scientist. I work largely in the area of biofuels and bio-based products, which is something we're not going to talk about today, but if you'd like to drill down on that, I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
I am Stephanie Batchelor. I am the U.S. representative for Below 50, which is a global campaign to advance low-carbon fuels in the U.S. and worldwide. I am also the Director of State and International Policy at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, which is the largest biotech trade association in the world. And we advocate and develop policies that help low-carbon fuel companies to advance, as well as renewable chemicals and bio-based product companies as well.
Good, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Christine, and thanks to the Port Authority for inviting us here to speak. My name is Neville Fernandez. I'm with Neste. Neste is a renewable diesel producer and a petroleum refiner. We've actually transformed our business from a petroleum refining business to also now produce renewable low-carbon fuels. Our U.S. headquarters is in Houston, Texas. That's where I'm from. Delighted to be on this panel today. My focus for the past 10 years has been on renewable diesel, and now going forward, looking to build the renewable jet fuel business to decarbonize aviation. So thank you for having us here today.
Good morning. My name is Brian Cherbico. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for World Energy. Thank you also for inviting us to participate, and thank you all for coming this morning. So World Energy is, we operate 8 biofuel refineries across Canada and the United States. Our business model is essentially to be a business-to-business solution provider, either to the oil and gas industry or ultimately to end users who have demand either through policy, which we'll get into today, or pull from customers with regard to solutions within the low carbon transportation fuels.
Great, thanks everybody. So I think I'd first like to level set so we go into the discussion with a common vocabulary. A lot of us hear multiple terms used in this space, so we hear biofuels, we hear renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, or sustainable jet fuel. And so I was hoping that, Bob, you can help the audience understand what the differences are among these types of fuels.
Sure, I'll give it a go and try not to confuse things more than they already are. So by definition, a renewable fuel is a fuel that's made from a renewable resource. That's simple enough. And a renewable resource, by definition, is a resource that's being continuously renewed, refreshed, replenished, so that at least in principle, you're never going to run out of it. That's the idea, at least. So biofuels, now I was told 5 minutes ago that I'm using the wrong term. It's now, help me, low carbon
fuels.
Low carbon fuels, all right.
Renewable low carbon fuels.
I don't think I'm going to be able to break
You could
out
say
of that.
biofuels.
Thank you,
but
biofuels.
We're good.
So biofuels, by definition, then are renewable fuels since they're made from renewable resources. Okay, so that's clear enough and simple enough. The other way to think about it is just by contrast with petroleum or fuels that are made from fossil, coal, oil, natural gas. Here, once the resource is used, it's depleted. And in principle, for a renewable resource, once it's used, it's regenerated and therefore not depleted. So that's the simple definition, or the simple answer to what a renewable resource is and a renewable fuel. Once you get past that, then things get a lot more complicated. Some good examples of renewable resources that are being used for what are known as first generation biofuels are things like corn, which are going into the corn ethanol business, and soybeans, which are going into biodiesel. Now, these are fairly large industries all around the world. They're fairly mature. The technologies are very well developed. And these materials are part of commerce. They're actually being used as fuels all around the world today. And a couple of my colleagues here today represent those industries, I think, very well. Second generation biofuels, however, are from non-food or non-edible resources. And so these are sometimes called cellulosic biofuels, meaning that the feedstock are lignocellulosic materials or waste materials. So some examples here would be forest residues, agricultural residues known as corn stover, wet waste, which essentially is sewage sludge, municipal solid waste, which is trash left over that we send out every day, and things like biogas coming from landfills and abandoned and other sources like that. So these technologies are not very well developed. Some of them are really in their infancy, and there's a lot of R&D and commercialization activities that have to happen before these second generation biofuels really become commercial or commercially viable technologies. But at the end of the day, the products are all the same. The fuels that we use are not going to be different as far as the end user is concerned. The fuels are not going to be different if it's a biofuel as opposed to a conventional petroleum-derived fuel, for example. Sure, some of these materials are blend stocks. For example, the ethanol that goes into gasoline, you can't tell whether that ethanol comes from biomass or whether it comes from, let's say, hydration of ethylene, for example. To the end user, it's completely transparent. It doesn't make any difference. To the technology that's used to produce that fuel, though, it makes a tremendous difference. Some of these technologies are not very mature and require a lot of R&D to go forward. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about conventional gasoline, conventional diesel fuel, which might look a lot different depending upon the technology that's used to manufacture it, and jet fuel. Jet fuel is really a special case, and I know that's one of the emphasis here is to talk about jet fuel, and I hope that we do get a chance to talk a lot about jet fuel. That's a special case. There, the restrictions are so great that the fuel has to be extremely tightly controlled as far as its characteristics are concerned. And there's only a few technologies at the moment that can meet those restrictions. But this is where biofuels, low carbon fuels is going to, in my opinion, is going to have its biggest impact is in the aviation sector. And so that's something hopefully we can talk about in some detail today.
Great, thanks, Bob.
So I think I'll leave it at that.
Does anyone have anything to add to that? I could see Brian, it seems you have something to say.
Sure. When we talk about advanced feedstocks and advanced fuels, I think there's some points that I think are worth mentioning. So within our company, we make a number of different fuel types across our different refineries. I would characterize some of our refineries as biodiesel, which it's an advanced biofuel. And again, we get into different bodies define things differently. So an advanced biofuel under federal policy would be a reduction of greenhouse gases greater than 50%. And so that's deemed to be advanced. In another one of our refineries, and similar to what Neste does in many of their refineries, we make renewable diesel. And we'll get into, I think, some more differences between the fuel types in a bit. But essentially, biodiesel is it still has oxygen. It's still slightly different from a traditional diesel fuel. It has different handling, different performance, whereas renewable diesel is a pure hydrocarbon, and as such, it meets the same characteristics, same specs, essentially the same performance, if not better, than petroleum diesel. So there are differences within what you call advanced fuels. And I guess one last comment that I would make with regard to feedstocks as well. In terms of when I think of the term sustainability, I also think about low carbon. And you talked about advanced being necessarily cellulosic. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. We think of ourselves today as making advanced fuels from some of these animal fats and greases. And I'll also talk about the impacts that we have within that industry. I think is quite interesting in terms of reducing carbon intensity. So we're large consumers of these agricultural products. And I think a positive unintended consequence that we've had is changing the behavior of those industries to reduce their carbon intensity and make them more sustainable. I know we'll talk a lot more as we go with regard to certain policies, but there are policies that actually enable the monetization of that carbon reduction by the agricultural industry. And we by taking that product, making it into a fuel that is within these frameworks, we can share that money and again incentivize better activity within the agricultural space to reduce their carbon footprint. So just a couple thoughts.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have anything to add? So it seems like there are a lot of different things going on in the market, and I don't know if there's a tipping point where there'll be some consolidation about feedstocks or processes. But one thing that has become dominant, I'm sure everyone has heard about the electrification of the transportation sector, but for aviation and shipping, and perhaps to a lesser extent some heavy-duty vehicles, we know that electrification poses a challenge. So Stephanie, I was hoping that you could talk about some of the environmental and other co-benefits of transitioning to sustainable fuels, even if it might be a bridge in certain cases to electrification.
Certainly. I mean, our conversation typically starts with greenhouse gas emission savings by the usage of these various biofuels. In California, through their low carbon fuel standards, so 2011 through 2018, there's been 30 million metric ton savings in greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at the renewable fuel standard, which is the bedrock policy at the federal level for the usage of alternative fuels, in its 10-year lifespan since RFS2 back in 2007, I think we've saved something like 1.9 billion emissions, which is the equivalent of taking 124 million cars off the road. So those are pretty staggering statistics, but to get to a little bit of a more granular level, just in terms of the various environmental and health benefits that you'll see when you use these kinds of fuels. So first, you can talk a little bit on the oxygen side. You need to have a high oxygen content in gasoline. The way that that used to be accomplished was through MTBE, as you all may be familiar, or the usage of something like benzene, which can be, of course, a cancer-causing agent. When you use ethanol and other biofuels, those risks are severely mitigated. You're talking about tailpipe emission savings from things like ground ozone, which can lead to asthma attacks and other respiratory issues. You will see a pretty large decrease in those kinds of tailpipe emissions when you use biofuels. Also, particulate matter is decreased, so that's why you have people like the American Lung Association out in California really strongly advocating for the usage of biofuels. Certainly when electrification and hydrogen fuels are possible, and you can talk about this whole suite of fuel options, that's great, but you can't really have that conversation without biofuels, and obviously on the aviation and maritime side, this needs to be a consideration. So those are some of the benefits. I hope that's what you were looking for.
Definitely, thank you. So I think everyone in the room is here for the greenhouse gas reduction and air quality benefits, but
I mean, we could talk also
biofuels
about
are not without their controversy, right? So obviously there are land use concerns, there are food security concerns, and I don't know if anybody else in the audience has other concerns that they want to throw into the mix. But local livelihood could be one. So I'm curious if anyone on the panel has some response to how these fuels can be developed truly sustainably and how we could validate that they are truly sustainable fuels.
I would just start. So Argonne Labs did a study, I think it was last year, and showing that corn-based ethanol, even with direct and indirect land use change calculations included within the usage of their fuels, was still 34% decreased greenhouse gas emissions to the baseline, which I think was significant. Of course, when people talk about land use change, they're often talking about corn. We don't typically have those conversations as much as we get into more of the cellulosics and the waste fuels. So certainly there have been a number of studies which we would be happy to point you guys to in terms of the sustainability of those types of fuels. But I don't know, Bob or anyone else in the panel, if you have something to add.
So I'd add something. So I'll use aviation fuel as an example. So in late 2015, we finished construction on what is the first renewable aviation refinery in the world, and still today. We actually converted a former petroleum refinery over to 100% renewable production, and our marquee product is renewable aviation fuel. In the process of doing that, we collaborated with a few different groups in terms of helping to measure our carbon intensity. One of them was a study that we did with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, where we did a study from the field all the way to the wing, measuring all of the various components to go into that score. And these things depend upon ultimately which feedstocks you choose, but in this instance, the one that we chose was a vegetable oil called camelina, which is an inedible agricultural crop. And we determined that carbon intensity score was a reduction of actually 84% relative to the petroleum aviation fuel. So it's critically important, I think, as we deliver these solutions to our stakeholders, to our customers, and ultimately their customers, to be able to have traceability in order to actually be able to demonstrate chain of control and to get the data behind this so we can make folks comfortable with the integrity of that carbon reduction. So we take advantage of an entity that's available to producers called the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials. It's a Swiss-based independent standards organization. that has, again, through collaboration internationally, determined acceptable standards to which you then subject yourself to audit with regard to your entire supply chain and production. And so there are independent groups, whether they're roundtable or in order to qualify for certain programs, federal and state, there are also requirements to demonstrate the underlying data so that these programs do have integrity. And there are bad actors, and they do ultimately, hopefully, get called out for their actions, and there are consequences as a result, and hopefully we all live within those. But we do think there are frameworks to make sure that we do have accountability.
And just on the renewable fuel standard has a clause within it that says that if you try to use land that was converted to cropland after 2007, it won't be determined to be renewable biomass.
Interesting. So it sounds like there are a number of different schemes out there. How does that impact the market in terms of really producing this and being able to assure your end users that it's sustainable when there's so many different schemes? Is there a need for a consolidation of those schemes?
So I think there are methodologies out there that everybody can ascribe to. You can, for example, you can go to Argonne's website and download GREET. And this is the model that everybody uses at the moment to determine the life cycle impacts of things like the feedstock that you use, the product that you make, land use, indirect land use, all these sorts of things. So the standards really are out there. I'll be the first one to admit that they're still in a high state of development. There are a lot of assumptions that go into a life cycle assessment that can have massive impacts on the bottom line, which is essentially the greenhouse gas emissions. But those metrics are out there. Those tools are being developed. And I think there's a lot of progress still to be made, but there's a lot of progress being made in really understanding what the real environmental impacts of these fuels are.
I would add, besides the third-party verification, I think what's important is for each of the companies, whether they're the biofuel producer or the end user or the NGOs, to be transparent, to volunteer the information that they have. So if it's supplier standards, if it's second-party audits, if it's third-party audits, if it's opening up for NGOs to come and visit, I think that's where the biofuel industry can confirm that, yes, these issues are important. Land use issues, indirect land use issues, labor issues, social justice. But all of these issues need to be addressed in determining the full sustainability of a biofuel and a feedstock. And as we encourage transparency and as we encourage other people to give input, I think that'll raise the credibility of the industry as a whole.
Thank you. So it's heartening to hear there are at least some standards out there, even if they are not necessarily consistent with one another. But what I'd like to get into now are the underlying supply and demand dynamics that exist today, and what changes we might need to make to attract some of that supply to the Northeast. So Brian and Neville, I'll start with you.
Sure. So the renewable diesel industry, for example, is a relatively new business. So it has only existed for the past 12 years. In fact, Neste commercialized the first renewable diesel plant in 2007. And now there's 2 billion gallons of capacity, still a small drop in the ocean compared to petroleum diesel, but 2 billion gallons in just over 12 years. I mean, we haven't even seen a new petroleum refinery in the U.S. build that sort of capacity. So there is a demand for this fuel for the low carbon property, but also, as Stephanie mentioned, for the positive or lower emissions from the tailpipe. And just to give some examples, almost every major city in California, with possibly the exception of Los Angeles, is now using renewable diesel at 100% level in their fleets. And they're using it not only because it's a low carbon fuel, because particulate is reduced by 30% from the tailpipe emission. Hydrocarbons are reduced 29%. NOx, which contributes to ground level smog, is reduced by 9%. So the demand for the fuel, because it's a sustainable fuel, because it leads to better air quality, because it's a low carbon fuel, continues to increase. And we're seeing that on a worldwide basis. In the Northeast, through initiatives like the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, creating that interest now not only on the diesel side, but also in the aviation space. And we can talk about that, about what are the other options to decrease or decarbonize aviation. We're going to have to look at biofuels, and we're going to send a strong signal to the producers to build that industry, to build the supply, because the demand will continue.
So I'll talk about the aviation sector specifically for a moment. So we all know that the aviation industry has been growing pretty robustly. If you've been to an airport, it's never been busier. And it's thriving. And the aviation industry several years ago recognized that with this growth, they are going to be contributing more and more, if they continued business as usual, to greenhouse gas emissions. And they recognize that as a primary objective to address that and hopefully move towards, or have a goal of moving towards, carbon neutrality. And they spent significant amount of time, R&D dollars, going into how to create better equipment, how to utilize that equipment differently, how to use fuel differently. And they sort of optimized that, whether it's the tips on the wings or using one jet to taxi versus running all of the jets, et cetera, those types of behavioral activities. But as they looked out into the future and they look at the primary emission factor of greenhouse, or creation of greenhouse gases, it's really the fuel. And so they sent large demand signals several years ago into industry stating that they were there to support the creation and ultimate production of renewable aviation fuels. And they've been terrific partners in trying to achieve that. It's really important. We talked about social justice and impacts locally. The emissions of these gases and impact into the environment, rather, have large concentrations at takeoff and landing within aircraft. And just so happens that airports very often happen to be in socioeconomically challenged areas. So it's a really important solution also for those areas, recognizing that moving to a renewable or sustainable aviation fuel actually also has in a jet a tailpipe emission improvement, if you will, in terms of particulate matter and other criteria emissions that are emitted out of the plane. So just another demand sector. We're now just starting to grow the production of those fuels, but there's a very large demand in that space, and again, going to be growing over time as to certain areas where there might be more immediate, obvious replacements, like gasoline, where you have all the other alternatives that are like electric that are happening. We don't see that happening anytime soon within the aviation sector, so that demand will remain robust for some time.
All right, so if there's robust demand in certain areas and it's growing, why don't we talk about cost? Is sustainable fuel at this point, or certain of them, at price parity with their fossil fuel cousins, or what really drives the cost premium, if any?
Should I start, Brian?
Sure, go ahead.
So the oil today is at about $70 per barrel, right? So the bio feedstock, which we use to make renewable fuels, is much higher price than that. But I think, Christine, rather than talking strictly about the price of the fuel, which is determined by the scale, by the feedstock, by the fungibility and the movement, the logistics, I think it's important to also look at the value of what value is renewable fuel bringing. So we talked about the low carbon value of it, the cleaner emissions of the fuel. But in addition to that, we have to try and monetize what is the cost of carbon, what is the cost of climate change, what are petroleum fuels and the emissions from petroleum fuels contributing, how are they contributing, and what is the real cost of that. And if we try to determine the cost of carbon, if we can monetize that in various forms, whether it's in the form of a mandate or in the form of a tax incentive, where it's trying to account for this cost of carbon, trying to account for the cost of pollution, trying to account for the cost of increasing greenhouse gases, then I think we can get to the true value of fuels and the true value of renewable fuels. And at that point, Christine, I think that the consumer already starting to appreciate and demanding sustainable solutions will then be able to compare what is the value. Am I getting better value from renewable fuels, from renewable chemicals, from renewable solutions, or is the petroleum or the fossil fuel and plastics still a better value? But I think we've got to be able to distinguish between what is price and what is value, and then compare the two on an equal basis.
So I'll try to add a couple sort of more practical, if you will, real-world market thoughts with regard to price. And again, I'll reference the California market and maybe answer an earlier question, which was what can be done in the Northeast to help incentivize more production and use of fuels. In California, they've got a program that does what Neville was talking about, which is essentially put a price on carbon. For transportation fuels, it's the low carbon fuel standard. And essentially, it sets a level of carbon intensity that needs to be achieved for fuels, and it's on a decreasing scale over the coming years. So each year you need to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel. And as such, you generate credits if you're producing certain low carbon fuels. And there are obligations or obligated parties that need to either reduce their specific fuel intensity or purchase these credits. So this mechanism creates a market trading and value of carbon. So what that means is, as a renewable fuel producer and seller in the state of California, we can monetize that, and essentially that is an extra revenue stream that offsets some of our costs that we then pass back on to our customers. And so when we're actually facing a fuel buyer and offering them our product, in many instances, and particularly today on the renewable diesel side, we're actually more competitive to the buyer with our product versus petroleum, meaning ours is cheaper. Now, in aggregate, again, it's more expensive, and that extra cost, that carbon cost, is getting transferred to a higher carbon producer versus a lower carbon producer. Which I think is that's the intent of the program, is to disincentivize high carbon and incentivize low carbon. And it's created an incredibly robust marketplace, such that if you look at the fuel world today in the United States, it's tipped towards California. A significant amount of the renewable fuel that's produced in the United States today is figuring out how to get into California because of the extra margin that's created because of the pricing of carbon. So we look forward to a day when other areas, these are not federal programs per se, they can be regional, they can be state, they're starting to be adopted in the Pacific Northwest. Canada's got carbon pricing that's happening. In the Northeast, that would be a massive boon if something like that from a scheme would be put together. And you'd see, I believe, a very quick change of behavior.
You talked, Christine, about challenges, and Neville said a word that I think is an important challenge for biofuels and biomass in general, and that's scale. When we look at the scale of biofuels in this country today, especially things like cellulosic ethanol, the scale is tiny. We're talking about one plant producing 20 million gallons per year of cellulosic ethanol. Compare that to a conventional petroleum refinery that processes maybe 500,000 barrels a day. Barrels, 42 gallons, you can do the math. So the industry really is very small, and one of the big challenges is figuring out how to get over this capacity, this scale factor, to become cost competitive. I really believe we have to find technologies that are going to allow biofuels to become scalable in a much bigger way than they are today.
You guys are doing a great job of advancing to several of the following questions. So why don't we just put a placeholder on the scale question for a moment, because I really want to get back to that. But on the policy side, so obviously we've heard a lot about the low carbon fuel standard. I'm just curious, obviously internationally there are other schemes out there. If any of you are familiar with other possible policy approaches that you think could be effective, and barring a low carbon fuel standard in the Northeast, is there something else that could be done to actually attract the supply other than potentially being willing to pay a much higher price?
Sure. So there's, shall I go ahead, Steph? So there are two ways to attract, or three ways to attract investment. One is to put in a mandate or a performance standard. You can also incentivize the production or new investments via tax incentives, via producers' tax credits, because some of these plants, and going back to the scale argument, the petroleum refineries in the USA are pretty much fully depreciated. But to put in a new biorefinery at the cost of several $100 million, right, for a few million gallons, it's an expensive proposition. So you need to have the project finance in place. You need to have investors, and so if there's an incentive to do that, whether it's loan guarantees or tax abatement to encourage this investment to be put in so that the fuel can be produced, that's one way to incentivize it without having a standard. And many jurisdictions around the world are doing that, where if there's no renewable fuel standard, then there's a way to attract these investments. And there are many benefits for that, including jobs, for example, which is a big seller in many jurisdictions, to promote this clean fuel technology.
So I would just piggyback to Neville's comments, or get to your original question. So just in terms of international standards that may be working, that could be adopted here. We talked a lot about the renewable fuel standard, the California low carbon fuel standard. So in the European Union, they have the Renewable Energy Directive, otherwise known as RED. They have RED 1 through the year 2020, and now they have RED 2 from 2020 and beyond to 2030. So what RED 2 has done is that they have put in place language encouraging the use of sustainable aviation fuel. They have, so in the RED directive, there's a 14% mandate, if you will, requirement. People are always very, we have to be careful about those kinds of terms, for renewable transportation fuels. And within that, there is a multiplier to encourage the use of sustainable aviation fuel. So that's something that's a bit new in terms of these broader policies to help incentivize those particular industries. I would say that the multiplier could be higher. So if you are going to create that kind of a program, ideally you want to create a true incentive. So you want to make that happen. But just to get back to Neville's point about what you can do here. So Massachusetts attempted to create a Northeast low carbon fuel standard a couple of years ago. They also attempted that a few years before that. I work closely on the state side, so I was very familiar with all of those efforts. And they pose a particular challenge in this region. So I would say New Jersey has had some success with creating a pretty strong diesel market. And part of that success is because New Jersey often has several of these tax incentives and production incentives for the creation, even all the way back to business plan payments and other types of incentives. So New York, for example, has a couple state policies in place to help to push more cellulosic biofuels. The really wonderful thing about the bio-based economy, which is what we refer to as this universe that has bio-based solutions instead of petroleum solutions, is that it can be implemented everywhere. So there's no reason that the Northeast can't have these types of plans. So if an LCFS isn't in your future, then look to some of these tax incentives or other potentials. They do exist. And we have a wealth of these cataloged. If anyone has particular questions, I can always send those to you after.
Great, thank you. So let's get back to the question of scale. I know when I talk to others about this issue, especially if they're not in the sustainability space, depending on the feedstocks you're talking about, especially when it comes to things like waste cooking oil, people just are completely skeptical and justifiably skeptical that we could ever really achieve the scale we need to meaningfully impact the aviation and the shipping sectors especially. And so I'm interested in knowing if any of you believe there will be emerging technologies that will help solve the scale problem, especially when we take into consideration some of the social equities that we already discussed, and which, if there are emerging technologies on the horizon, which of those really excite you?
I'll take an initial stab at it. First of all, within the commercially available and what I'd call at scale feedstocks of animal fats, oils, and greases, there's still some room. Certainly more refineries will be coming online over the next year or two within that space. But it doesn't answer ultimately how we meaningfully scale. I would say that I'd point out two interesting areas that are gaining traction. Two different technologies. One is Fischer-Tropsch, which is a gasification process. There are a couple industry-leading companies that are in the process of commercializing those technologies, and we should see some near-term results, we hope, within the next couple of years. And what that means is within that, those feedstocks that go into that process could be woody biomass, and there are all sorts of types of products that fit within that category. And suddenly the availability of sustainably grown or reprocessed or processed materials is substantially larger than the fats, oils, and greases, and I think can suddenly scale to make a substantial dent. And there are commercial projects that have broken ground that are in process of being brought online, like I said, in the next couple of years. I'll call out one, Fulcrum, which has received a significant investment from United Airlines recently. So again, the pull from industry to help commercialize these types of technologies. What's interesting to me about that is those are green crude oils, if you will. They ultimately still need to be hydroprocessed by refineries that we operate and Neste operates. So those could be feedstocks that continue to feed into both the traditional refining industry and an advanced refining industry. Another one that has some attention, needs a little bit more work, is the Pyrolysis Oil Pathway. Again, taking woody biomass materials, very different technology, but ultimately could make a green crude, and there are other companies focused on working on that. Ensign's a company in that space that's trying to go commercialize that. And those would be groundbreaking, very substantial step change moves that open up the feedstock opportunities. So woody biomass is massive.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, just dovetailing off what Brian said, the resource really isn't the problem. Recent update of the billion-ton study now has got us up to 1.5 billion or 1.6 billion tons of renewable, sustainable biomass just in the United States alone. So the resource itself is massive. The scale problem really is more on the technology side, and that is, how do we take this, what is a very distributed resource, and somehow bring it into some sort of a central processing facility, whether it's Fischer-Tropsch, whether it's a pyrolysis facility, you name it, whether it's a fermentation type of operation. You know, how do we solve that particular part of the issue? And that's in my mind, at least, that's a technology problem. The resource is there at scale. We have to figure out how we match the distributed nature of the resource to the technology. And I think those cost-effective solutions are coming now. And I'm really, we're a big part of those development activities right now. So yeah, I think the scale issue can be solved for biomass.
And I would also add to Bob's point on the scale issue, which of course is technology driven, but when you have a stable investment climate, and that really speaks to the policy side of it, these things all work together. So if you have stable policies in place, then investment comes to the table. You have more investment, you have more opportunities to take more tech innovative stances, and that's something that we have had a problem with here. The renewable fuel standard has been in place, but there have been a number of, there have been 48 waivers given to small oil refineries who are not really small oil refineries, and there have been a number of issues, I would just say, that have made that not the stable policy that it should have been to help to drive this industry. And we really see that in the growth or sometimes lack thereof on the cellulosic side. So I would just add that in addition to the technology, you really have to have a stable policy picture to help to push those fuels forward.
Right. And on that, it sounds like in the case of United, there are opportunities for the private sector to come in and partner and try to advance that technology development, and obviously some broad policy initiatives to create that stable investment environment. But outside of that, are there other roles for government, say, in helping to incubate these technologies and commercialize them? And if so, do you see any of that happening today?
I think the push by governments to try and incentivize research and development as well will help to spur these technologies, to give some encouragement to explore what are the different technologies that could be developed to produce renewable fuels. There's a good project in Quebec. I forget the name of that. It's in the Lac Mégantic area, I believe, Beto, I think it's called. But they're encouraging public-private partnerships to come together to look at new technology and see what can be commercialized. One other thing I could add, Christine, is that it's also encouraging to see the traditional petroleum refiners also now looking into the space of what they can do to produce renewable fuel. So we've seen co-processing of renewable feedstock with petroleum feedstocks in existing refineries, so that can immediately use the infrastructure and the scale of the petroleum assets. But also new technologies being developed. Shell is looking at hydropyrolysis, for example. Neste is a good example, having transformed our 260,000 barrel a day petroleum refinery business into now adding almost a quarter of that is renewable fuel processing, and we're seeing that from other refiners as well. And so that's I think a good sign of encouragement that we are going to get to scale.
And I guess before we move off scale, I'm hearing a lot of the millions of barrels and billions. Can we just get a sense of the proportion? So when I heard a few of you say that we believe the feedstock exists, it's really about the distribution or it's about the production. Is that feedstock available to fully replace the hydrocarbon equivalent? Or what proportion are we really talking about here?
Do you know, Bob?
I can shoot a statistic at you for that. The DOE recently, when they published the update to the Billington study, said that about 30% of our transportation fuels could be replaced by bio-derived transportation fuels, given the current resource, about 30%.
In the U.S.?
In the U.S.
Okay. That's helpful. And so knowing that at best right now we have about a 30% displacement rate, what do you think, how does sustainable fuels fit within a suite of solutions to decarbonize transportation? And so I know we talked a little bit about hydrogen fuel cells and potentially small scale renewables. What other technologies are out there that you think there could be a symbiotic relationship with? Or anything else I don't know about?
Well, one thing we've recently announced, Neste has, is in addition to our efforts in the biofuels, we're also now starting a project to reuse plastics, so plastic liquefaction. So not only recycling the plastics, but any of the plastics which cannot be recycled, instead of sending them to landfill or incinerations, we're actually going to now look at technologies to liquefaction technologies to then feed those back as a liquid into our petroleum refineries, so to make fuels out of these plastics which would otherwise have been landfilled or incinerated. So not a renewable fuel, but still a sustainable fuel, because you're utilizing a resource which has already been produced, and you're preventing a barrel of crude oil being taken out of the ground to be made into fuel.
Thank you. Anyone have any other thoughts on other technologies that are out there? Okay, great. So I think what I'd like to do before we open up for Q&A is, I know for myself I've learned a lot in the course of this discussion, but we have a room full of people from different walks of life or different disciplines, including, as I said earlier, policymakers and bankers and advocates. So what action items can we take out of here that we can follow up on and really have an impact on the adoption of sustainable fuel? And that could be for a particular set of stakeholders, everyone, or a subset of the stakeholders in the room.
Well, I think that advocacy is a really important thing. Actually, make a couple observations. First, I think it's important to make a positive observation. Stepping back, this discussion's gotten technical and in the weeds and very specific. Sometimes it's good to get away from the trees and look at the forest for a second. I'm excited to be here in the Northeast having this discussion with this group and reflecting upon the fact that what's happened over the last 10 years is pretty substantial and important. And that discussions about reduction of carbon has become a common thread that we come across on a regular basis. 10 years ago, we were not having these discussions. I would say that carbon reduction is sort of the new normal, and I would say that the reason that I'm optimistic about that is, as I look at my children and younger generations, they've not known a world without this discussion, and so that's embedded and that's not going to change. So that's very encouraging. Having said that, I spent a lot of time in these different forums with these particular groups, and we all talk about it, but I'm always amazed when I get out and whether it's in Washington, locally within where our refineries are, or at the state levels with the governments and the policymakers, how little they actually are exposed to the details that we're getting into now. So, if I could advocate for one thing, it would be advocacy by each of you. Talk about these issues, especially to anybody who has any influence over policy. It's important that they understand these ideas and that you're sending demand signals to them and making it a priority in what they're doing.
Yeah, I was with Brian yesterday in Chicago at a fuel summit, and one of the points that was raised there by one of the panels was that there's an increasing demand not only by consumers but by businesses to have more sustainable choices. And we heard from a couple of companies yesterday who have realized that to attract the best talent and to meet the demands of their own customers, they have to become more sustainable. There was a metric thrown out yesterday where this one company, a consulting company, has quantified the carbon footprint of each employee, and I think it was 3 tons per person per year, in order to deliver a solution to their clients. And there's a metric on that where they're trying to reduce it, and their customers are demanding it. They have these balanced scorecards where they want to see what is that company doing to reduce its carbon footprint. They have a list, for example, of hotels where they rank the hotels with a green leaf and encourage their employees to utilize that list and make their choice of where do they want to stay. And they've shown by tracking it that their employees are choosing those hotels with the green leaf, even if it's at a higher cost. So I think there's an opportunity here for each of us as consumers, as employees, as employers, to utilize that, to take advantage of that, and use that as a case to drive your own business. And by pulling sustainable solutions, by demanding sustainable fuels, low carbon fuels, renewable fuels, it'll encourage more investment. It'll encourage more production. So Christine, you asked for a call to action. So I think each of us should. I think there's nobody actually opposed to wanting a cleaner environment, to fighting climate change, to reducing greenhouse gases. But if we vote with our wallets, then we can really pull that demand.
Thank you. Stephanie or Bob, any parting thoughts on this topic?
I would say something similar to Neville and Brian. For the companies in the room, make a commitment. We're all passionate about sustainability, but it's very easy to say that and not to take action upon it. So make a commitment to be more sustainable. And how do you accomplish that? you advocate. You advocate on behalf of what you care about, on what is sustainable. You work with policymakers to enact stable policies, and you educate. So I would just add educate on as my action word, because we can advocate in a variety of ways, but there are a number of stakeholders, maybe some of you in the room, who may have never even heard of these kinds of fuels before. So I think first we have to get the right people having these conversations. A lot of times we joke that we sit in these rooms and we talk to ourselves, you know, but we need to make sure that all of the necessary stakeholders are sitting in this room and having that conversation. So maybe I'm changing my call to action. Get all the right people in the room.
Great, well, hopefully we did some of that
Hopefully
today.
we started that today, yes.
Bob?
Yeah, I'd just like to end by telling a story, if I could, for a second.
Of course.
I work at a place with a lot of really smart people that come to work every day thinking they're going to save the world, and maybe they will. But we had the pleasure the other day of having the CTO of one of the world's largest energy companies in our conference room. And we were all making our usual death by PowerPoint presentations to this gentleman about the wonderful research we're doing to save the world. And I got about 15 minutes into my presentation, and he just went, stop, pause. He says, I really think your technology is fantastic. I understand what you're trying to do, but you tell me how it's going to move the needle. Show me how this technology is really going to move the needle. How are we going to get to a carbon neutral society? And in fact, he said more than that. He said, we believe the fuel of the future actually has to be carbon negative. Show me how you're going to get there. Show me how you're going to move the needle. We all need to be showing people how we can move the needle and talking about moving the needle. And it's part of advocacy. It's part of education. Mm-hmm. Those are the things we need to do.
I just want to share one anecdote. It's not the call to action discussion point, but one thing that I find exciting and want to at least share. We get to do some pretty impressive and incredible things, and as a result, we do attract the attention of some unbelievable companies. In the last 2 weeks, I've been very fortunate to have had discussions with two of the largest oil and gas companies in the world, the second largest food manufacturing company in the world, and one of the two largest aviation companies in the world. And these were senior management talking about how they can further their commitment to utilizing low carbon fuels. The momentum within that level of industry today is one we've not had before. So it's not an obvious policy environment to have that happening at this moment. It's actually, we've got, quite frankly, a federal government that's not supportive of a lot of these policies at the moment. But the action that's happening within these leading industries is, again, unprecedented in the face of that. So globally, at this point, we've passed a tipping point, and it's very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm excited. I know we're still in. So I really thank the panel for taking my questions, and I think it's now time to open it up to the rest of you. So we should have a couple of microphones available here. Dana and Alex, let's hear from you.
Hello, can you hear this? It's on? Yeah. Hello, I'm Michael Raftery I'm an ocean engineer with Martin and Ottaway out of Red Bank, New Jersey. I'm a specialist in marine renewable energy, and I'd like to ask the panel their input on the state of the macroalgae biofuel technology. How scalable is it, and what fuels can we synthesize from macroalgae?
You want me to take that?
Please.
So macroalgae, and microalgae for that matter, macroalgae in particular, suffers from exactly the word, that four-letter word, scale. How do you come up with not only the technology part is not the difficult part, the agricultural part is the difficult part, right? How do you do the agriculture, the growing, and in particular the harvesting of macroalgae so that you can make a difference? I think that's really where the problems are. There's a lot of people working on this around the world, but there's a lot of work yet to be done.
Great conversation. Thank you. Sir Pilgeron, Rutgers University, New Jersey. There is a new concept emerging, energy, water, food nexus. and that low carbon fuels are important, but would you think that especially encouraging second generation biomass into sustainable fuels would help, would be encouraged if we also bring water footprint into the conversation? What would you think about that? Thank you.
Did everyone hear the question?
Should I repeat again?
Can you please?
Okay, sorry. There's an emerging concept, energy, water, food nexus.
Okay.
Yeah.
Everything is related, as you know, and we cannot just look into only carbon, only. So energy has water footprint, water has energy footprint, food and food waste also has other carbon and water footprint. Do you think that, especially for second generation biomass coming into play, which is more lower carbon than first generation biomass into fuels, do you think that this concept and this research should be also brought into the conversation?
That's a great question, especially as climate change will impact our water availability. Does anyone on the panel have thoughts on that question?
I think there is quite a lot of work now, and the water issue is a big issue already in the conversation, and what is the water footprint of feedstock. So it is being talked about now. I think the challenge is also how do we develop feedstock on arid lands or semi-arid lands or using brackish water, for example. So that is an ongoing topic. There is a lot of development work being done on that. And then there's a trade-off between should you use the existing land with water for a better yield or sacrifice the yield and use low water. So I think it's part of the whole conversation, and certainly not something that's being ignored by the feedstock development companies.
I had the opportunity to work in the Middle East for a few years, and there the issue is not energy security, of course, it's food security and water, but those two are very tightly connected. And actually there's some very interesting work going on in the Middle East now on developing systems that essentially look at the food, fuel, and water nexus in a very positive way. Masdar Institute, a sister school of MIT, is working on this. I had the pleasure of working on that with the airline industry and also with the biofuels companies like UOP. So there is work going on exactly this issue.
I think the fuel industry, I think Boeing's involved in this.
Boeing is in that project as well, yeah.
Producing fuel as well as food at the same time in a circuit.
Yeah.
Question back here.
Scale is a problem with that, by the way.
Okay.
We calculated you'd have to plant the entire United Arab Emirates in California in order to get 10% of the jet fuel demand satisfied. So scale is still a problem.
Question back here. And that's a good segue on scale. My name is Paul Miller. I'm with the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management. It's a multi-state organization based here in the Northeast. And a number of the questions posed this panel have already poked at this, but it's the scale to meet demand. As background, NESCOM, my organization, has done greenhouse gas mitigation scenario analysis for a number of our member states. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York and New Jersey, by the way, are also members. And when we project the use of biofuels, we do use the billion-ton study, and we do come up with essentially a 30% replacement of transportation fuels or petroleum fuels. But to achieve an 80% reduction in the long term, it's not going to meet demand. So we have to make decisions about prioritizing. And here in the Northeast, we also have, for example, a lot of home heating oil demand, and that's a big market for biodiesel. But there are zero carbon technology alternatives for home heating, like thermal heat pumps. So when you have limited volume, and I think if you can scale it up, there'll be plenty of demand, plenty of market for it, but what makes the most sense, because there aren't other alternatives. And certainly aviation strikes me as one, but I'd like to get your sense of even if we scaled up but couldn't displace all the petroleum we're using now in transportation, where as policymakers should we be prioritizing where to direct those biofuels? because there are alternatives in other modes of transportation.
Well, I think you hit on one, and that is aviation. So aviation accounts for 2% of the greenhouse gases globally. Aviation is growing at a rate of 5% per year. And at least for the next generation of planes, there won't be any other energy source other than hydrocarbon fuels. So if there's no other alternative to, and the engine manufacturers and the airplane manufacturers and the airlines have already done a lot through their operational changes, through the infrastructure changes, through new technology of engines, they've done all of this to reduce their carbon footprint. But to reduce it even further and to meet the aviation industry's goal of carbon neutral growth and 50% of reduction of their footprint by 2050, we'll need low carbon renewable fuels, low carbon jet fuel. And so if we can incentivize that, as Stephanie mentioned, European Red has done that to a premium of 20% over road transportation diesel. If we can incentivize that to drive renewable fuels to aviation because there are alternatives to decarbonize road transportation, I think that'll be a very strong signal and a good incentive then to further decarbonize aviation through the use of renewable jet fuels.
Just a quick question. Is there a leading feedstock plant for the fuels you're talking about? I feel like I never get a straight answer to that question. Is it a politicized question? Is it loaded, or is it just, are there still competing alternatives? Is maybe your top two, maybe?
Leading plant. So there are a lot of ways to think about that. I mean, demonstrably there are crops that have great complexion, so low water use, high energy content, can readily able to be grown and utilize existing infrastructure to cultivate those types of things. One of the biggest challenges is changing farmer behavior. Another one is again, can those crops compete against the massive industrialized row crops that dominate globally? I spent the early part of my career working on alternative crops. Camelina was one that I spent a lot of time working on in conjunction with government agencies trying to incentivize. Farmers don't change behavior quickly. It's a very slow-moving endeavor. But we're getting there. I think it's going to be a patchwork solution, quite frankly, over time. But continuing to send the demand signals and continuing to create the policy that incentivizes that work will be helpful. I don't think it's politicized. I don't think there's a silver bullet solution. I think technologies will continue to evolve that will continue to create demand signals. If we can get the technologies, for instance, to successfully convert biomass, you'll see sustainably grown crops that aren't grown today happen sustainably in scale. Again, woody biomass type crops. So I think that R&D is there. I just don't think that there's a silver bullet answer. It's not that people are intentionally crowding out the conversation. I don't know if you have a different opinion from...
No, I think that's exactly right, Brian. It's not a political issue. At the end of the day, everything is an economic issue. And the thing about biomass is it's very regional, of course. If you're in the Midwest, you're not going to be using forest residues. If you're in the Northwest, you're not going to be using agricultural residues. So, it varies by regionality, and then at the end of the day, it's all about the economics. It's all about the cost. I mean, nobody wants anything. Something is not worth anything unless somebody wants it. I remember when I started at NREL, biomass was $20 a ton. Now it's $100 a ton because suddenly it's become monetized. So it's a complex thing. It's related to regionality. It's related to technology, but it's definitely not a political issue as far as I can tell, at least.
Yeah, my name is Jerry Biscardi. I'm with Allied Aviation. Just to put it in perspective, my company handles about 30% of all the kerosene consumed in this country. And right in this region alone at the 3 Port Authority airports, 10% of the 20 billion gallons are used right here. Now, there's 2 terms we use in the industry, fit for purpose, and I think you guys are getting there, we see these, we call it SPK, synthetic paraphenetic kerosene. It's jet fuel, biojet. And we've used a lot of biojets. I've been on many of the projects with KLM, Lufthansa. Now, JetBlue is actually, we're in discussion right now. The issue is, the other term we use is called drop-in.
Yep.
And we're wrestling with that. And I'm just wondering, where are you as the folks, because you're driving this industry, when you could theoretically drop in 50,000 barrels of biojet in Pasadena, Texas, and I could get credit for it up here in New York, because until we resolve that, we're moving this biojet around in diesel trucks, you know. So where are we where we can actually get it into the supply chain?
So I'll talk about what we're doing in California. And I understand the concept of trying to mass balance allocate renewable. We do it in different industries today quite well, so that you can have generation of these fuels done in a very cost-effective way and distributed through a system. Again, if you've got a buyer willing to buy it and they're not geographically located in the area where it's being consumed, they can still get credit by mass balance allocating it across the system. In jet fuel, we just have too little of the molecules being produced to even bother doing that. So we've got the one refinery in Southern California that's producing, and we're sending our fuel to LAX daily. We've been doing that for 3 years. It doesn't make sense to shift the physical molecules across the country. So I think the paradigm exists if we can get larger production. And I just don't think that we're there yet in terms of scale of the refining of the actual materials. I don't know if you have a different thought.
But just to be clear, there are 5 approved renewable fuels under ASTM 7566, which is the standard. And there are certain blend level limits associated with that. And so when that is blended, for example, the jet fuel that Altair produces, ASTM 7566 Annex A2, same fuel that Neste produces, blended at a maximum 50% with Jet A or Jet A1. But once it's blended, that's a fully fungible fuel. It meets ASTM 1655, which you're familiar with. It can be put in the pipeline, it can be put in a truck, in a storage tank, and into the wing of the plane. So it's already drop-in at that stage, and that's what we produce right now.
Well, the consideration of what we've been challenged with, once that 7566 becomes 1655 and it gets put into the pipeline, upstream can never become blending stock.
That's true.
Ocean can never
Yeah,
guarantee-
that is true.
Right, so, well, these are the real life challenges that I'm faced with, and that's why we keep it out of the pipe. So we need to get to that point where maybe we never use it as blending stock again, all the, you know, the combinations
yeah.
are put at the point of entry, but our world here is what we call a commingled world.
Sure.
So when we get up to New York and Linden, New Jersey, I don't care whose fuel it is, gets dumped into one tank. So you lost those molecules that were derived from a biostock. So can you just like book it in, like just say, so-and-so bought it, it's there, when they fly their airplane, they get credit for it. See, like the captain.
So we do that today. I'll give you, again, a real-world example. When we send our fuel to LAX, it goes into the common tank farm there. It goes into the hydrant system. We don't have segregated tanks. So it goes in with everybody else's fuel. So for the last 3 years, United, who has been causing that to be produced and they're purchasing it, we're delivering it to them, or our other airlines that are flying out of LAX, they get to, what you say, book and claim. They claim that environmental credit. The molecules are going off to all of the airplanes. So if you've flown out of LAX in the last 3 years, you might have had one molecule of ours in a plane. But it's in all the different airplanes. But it's only those that actually have entered into a commercial offtake contract that can claim that environmental credit. So again, the paradigm exists. We just don't have the molecules to be sending off to larger areas. I've got a question back at you. You said upstream you're not able to use it as a blend stock. I didn't understand that comment.
Well, technically, if you take 25% D7566 bio, pure, straight run.
Yeah.
And then you neat, I think is the word.
Right.
You take the neat and put it in 75% kerosene.
Mm-hmm.
Now you move that up. Now say there's another entrant of 7566. You can't use that fuel because you can't guarantee how much, because it's limited 50% at ASTM. So that's the dilemma. So we just steer around it and bring it up in trucks. Not me, but our partners. I just handle the stuff. I don't own it. I put it in places that I don't own. But that's our dilemma, because when we have to perform, and this is Maddie Mulcahy, she's from our lab, Neville Petroleum, she analyzes out of her lab 10% of all the jet fuel used in commercial aviation. And we've been watching jet fuel for a long time. We see trends. You know, we see thermal stability, what we call jet kind of fall off. We see things happening. And our airline partners are concerned with what you're putting into my commingled tank. You might be the one that's causing fuel to fall off spec. So what we do is we don't blend. We, you know, what we call batch numbers.
Right.
Once we get up to a certain point where it's common tankage, batch numbers are gone. So you cannot guarantee that if you use that kerosene now, D1655, as a blend stock with neat 7566, you might be violating ASTM.
Right. That's a very interesting point.
That's reality.
I personally think that that's addressable. I'd like to talk to you afterwards, because I think actually when that upstream blend activity that you want to do, once you have to create first the neat component, and it has an ASTM table which you need to satisfy. In order to meet the second stage of blending, you need a certain quality of your petroleum blend stock. So even if it had previously been blended, if you test that and get a certificate of analysis of that quality, it doesn't mean it's going to fail. So I think that there are methods that we could consider and possibly talk to the ASTM panel about of certifying that previously blended product to be a qualifying blend stock thereafter. But it's really about aromatics and some other things that they're concerned about. So, right,
But in fact, it has been addressed on the diesel side, on renewable diesel. So when renewable diesel has been put into the pipeline, into the colonial pipeline, they've come up with new grades. There used to be only the 62 grade, now there's the 61 grade, 62 grade, 63 grade, just specifically to address that issue of downstream blending with renewable fuels. But one final thing on that, when you say that you don't know when you're getting the renewable jet into petroleum, you should be happy when you get it. It increases thermal stability. It gives you a higher energy density. So you should consider yourself blessed when you get it.
We need to talk about that. Your blending percentages, I think maybe the last stuff we're looking at is around 17%, 75, 66, 50, to still keep the energy density that we need. And I'm going to, again, I don't like to be a harbinger of bad news, but when oil gets up to $70, $72 a barrel, we start to see oil from other sources. Tar sands, fracking, alternative, we call them syn crudes, because they're not truly crudes, but they carry with them other things that we don't see in traditional Mideast.
I totally agree with you. We want to avoid tar sands for sure, but this sounds like a great sidebar conversation. Okay. We know each other, so
it's just things we need to address, because the reality of it is, in the laboratory, when we fail thermal stability, in a commingled batch, there's a bunch of lawyers pointing to whose fuel spoiled the soup.
Thank you
And
for that.
reality. And I'm sorry, I don't want to take us off.
No worries. We have a few more questions here. One on this side, one on that side. We have a couple in the back. Okay.
Hi, how are you? My name is Yasmin. I'm with Dewberry Engineers. I have actually two questions that kind of tie into each other. As a form of technology, have we ever considered solar energy for aviation? When you're up at such a high elevation and closer to the sun, essentially just basic physics, you know, you're closer to solar, why not use solar as a form of energy to power your aircraft? Another question is, have we ever considered for water, you know, you mentioned how do you use agriculture as a means of new sustainable resources and fuels for these aircrafts? Have we considered drip irrigation? I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but you mentioned Middle East. Have we looked at those technologies? Have we considered them?
Thanks. Maybe some of our airline partners in in the room could speak a little bit more to the solar-powered aircraft question, unless some of the panelists have some thoughts there. But on the topic of drip irrigation and crop cultivation, any thoughts?
I can talk to you offline about it. I'm not sure I can help, but I can talk to you offline.
Thank you, but great ideas. Yes, we have a question over here.
Airline, but I've seen a single person airplane go around the world on solar.
Yes, they actually took off and flew into JFK.
Yeah, okay.
Solar and pulse, exactly. Yeah, that was really exciting.
Yeah, but I think the weight issue and all of that.
Single passenger. So, exactly. Right here. Okay, another question?
Yeah, hi, good morning, thank you. My name is Phil Voss. I'm with an environmental nonprofit called Energy Vision. I think I'm sort of...
Please speak up.
Something wrong with the mic?
Is it on?
Is there something wrong? Should be on.
That better?
I hear it. You hear
Okay.
it, right?
You're good?
Yeah. I hear
Okay.
it.
Okay. I think this follows up on a couple of points, including zero carbon negative emissions and scalability, and the availability of feedstocks. Biogas comes out of landfills, also using readily available technology. It can be derived from food waste, it can be derived from wastewater biosolids, it can be derived from animal manures on farms. If you upgrade that biogas by removing the moisture and the CO2 and the hydrogen sulfide and some other stuff that's in there, you have biomethane, or renewable natural gas, which is so chemically similar to natural gas, to fossil natural gas, that it can be used for all the same things, including as a transportation fuel. When it is made from food waste or from dairy manure, it is actually carbon negative on a life cycle basis. And when it is made from landfill gas or from wastewater biosolids, it is close to carbon neutral. The supply is abundant. The technologies for extracting the biogas and upgrading it already exist. And I was just wondering what the panel's thoughts in this area were.
So we're focusing on sustainable liquid fuels here, but I'm sure there are liquefaction opportunities for biogas. But
Well, it is being used. It is being used today, yeah, by a company called Trillium is running it. They're marketing it. Clean Energy produces it. So it is being produced at scale today, generating G3 RINs and supporting the renewable fuel standard.
But in terms of heavy-duty vehicle use, something like 20% of transit buses currently run on natural gas, and 60% of refuse collection trucks are natural gas models. And it can be, as you know, liquefied or compressed.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on development of this resource, expansion of the technology, et cetera?
Yeah, no, I do think that it is being developed, it is being scaled up. There's great progress being made, especially in California, on converting vehicles to that, both transit vehicles and other heavy-duty vehicles. And the infrastructure is being built up around that as well.
more questions?
All right, this works. Okay.
Here.
Does someone have it before me?
And go ahead.
Okay.
We just have one.
Sorry. Peter Rose from the Quebec Government Office. Thank you, Port Authority, for convening us, and thank everybody for coming out for Climate Week, and the experts for your inputs and your time. And thanks for the shout out to Quebec. That wasn't planted. I appreciate that. And also to California. California has a cap and trade carbon market that's linked with Quebec's. So we've been doing this for 4 years, putting a price on carbon, and I think the policy signal has definitely helped in the transportation space. My question was about the International Civil Aviation Organization based out of Quebec and Montreal. Are they doing enough at the multilateral level? That was my question. I'm answering the call to educate and to advocate. So I also wanted to give a real-world example about a company that's doing biofuels, sustainable fuels out of Quebec. Agrisoma that just out of mustard seed helped United Airlines do a 11-hour transatlantic flight, and there's some other things like that. And also to think beyond the fuel side of things, if we're trying to reduce carbon emissions, we can look into artificial intelligence. If you want to be queuing your airplanes or your trucks, that could help reduce fuel consumption. And also what you make your airplanes out of, we talked about that a lot. You can get to zero carbon aluminum. That project's happening up in Quebec right now with Apple, the federal government of Canada, the province of Canada, Alcoa, and Rio Tinto. So I just wanted to plug all that and then ask that question on the ICAO.
I'll take a shot. I'll continue on some of the shout outs. So thank you for mentioning the Agrisoma activity that took place recently. I'll shout out to Aaron Robinson, who's in the audience from United Airlines. Part of the model that we had in developing our facility in California was actually to create an integrated supply chain mechanism to be able to convert various feedstocks into renewable transportation fuels that are essentially hydrocarbons, and then put them into high-profile customers, whether it's the United Airlines of the world or the UPSs of the world, to incentivize companies to go do specific R&D on potential advancements in feedstock. I had mentioned camelina earlier. Carinata, which is Agrisoma's mustard seed product, is sort of a slightly more advanced version of that. The model I mentioned has attracted a relationship between our company and Agrisoma to collaborate. So the flight that you mentioned was our second collaboration. We did fly that. We converted their mustard seed oil into jet fuel and delivered it to San Francisco. So SFO had this flight with at the carbon event that the governor of California had a couple of weeks ago, the Global Climate Action Summit. So I just wanted to do a couple more shout outs there, and we're very appreciative of the work and the incentives that Canada has been providing on the R&D side, and definitely a lot of leadership on that side. With regard to ICAO, again, I think that that's an important thing to point out. Aviation fuels are different from a lot of the other fuels that we're talking about, especially with regard to regulation. They aren't regulated at the state levels that we have in the United States. They're much more federally regulated. And so a lot of these schemes that take place, the governments and the agencies that are putting the regulations in don't have direct oversight or controls over them. So a lot of these are opt-in programs. So they're really driven by the organizations themselves and the members of those, the aviation industry itself, that are saying, this is a priority, we want to figure out how to participate in it. We understand that we're large contributors, and while we're not necessarily mandated, we want to figure out how we can take advantage and contribute and participate in that. And ICAO is one of those agencies or organizations that helps do that. And I think it's important to point out, you can think of it almost as self-inflicted. So the industry has decided that they want to participate. They're almost self-taxing themselves through ICAO on an international level to force themselves or to create better behavior as an industry. And so they're creating a program that's coming up that's going to actually create another monetization opportunity for producers, so we can offset the costs again by essentially the participants taxing themselves and creating a fund that's allowing us to create more cost-effective solutions for them. So just to comment on ICAO. Could they do more? We think, of course, they could do more, but they are taking steps, again, voluntarily, so it's to be commended. I don't know if you've got more comments on ICAO.
No, well summarized there, Brian.
Thanks.
And I would just add briefly 2 points. First, Agrisoma is a biomember, so thank you for bringing them up in this context. They're a wonderful company. But I also do want to just highlight briefly the comment you made sort of about bio-based products in airplanes. This is a sustainable fuels forum, but I think when we're thinking more outside the box and when we're thinking more sort of holistically, again, about how the bio-based economy can move forward, I think those are the kinds of things that you're thinking of also, soy-based foams in your car seats. Certainly we're talking about, airplanes. You're talking about all the types of energy efficiencies that you can gain by using renewable chemical-based products versus petroleum. So a number of our companies work on those kinds of projects as well. So I would just say, while you're thinking about all of these things, don't think of them in a vacuum, and think about how you can factor in those emissions across your supply chain.
Any more questions from the audience? We have one up here. Oh, Dave has a question there, and then we have one in the front.
Thank you. I won't take long. David Bomke with the New York Energy Consumers Council and the Fulcrum Group currently. Thank you all very much for your presentation. In 10 years of going to Climate Week New York events, never have I seen a stronger plea from a panel to engage the audience in the issues of advocacy and education. And that's clearly a responsibility we all are committed to. That's why we're here. But it's not the people in this room, it's the people we interact with where we really have to make that difference. I would only ask that we acknowledge Christine's role in this, and I always think in terms of advocacy, connectedness, and education. And clearly the connectedness of bringing these people together on both that side of the stage and this side is extraordinarily important. I'm a very simple-minded person, ACE, ACE. Take it with you in these conversations and bring up all three of those as you go forth. The other comment is going to betray how totally ignorant I am and how much I have forgotten about organic chemistry classes in the early 1970s before most of you were born. Could you help me better understand the carbon impact? We've heard a lot about the issue of carbon, low carbon on the generation of the product. I don't think we have enough clue about the carbon impact of the output when we use these different fuels. And I would like to engage you in that conversation as well, whether it's better or worse to use one product or another product, not only in the production, but also on the output. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thanks for recognizing the Port Authority's role here. Do you just have a carbon balance question?
Yeah, I can take first crack at that. So on the output side, when you burn a fuel, you're going to produce carbon dioxide and water and any unburned. So on the output side, you're not going to really reduce, if you're using a hydrocarbon fuel, whether it's from petroleum or a biofuel, the turbine emission or the tailpipe emission. But what you're doing, the reason it's a low carbon fuel, of course, is that the source of energy is absorbing carbon dioxide from the air. So if it's a planted crop, if it's a forest residue, if it's a waste from animal processing, the animals ate the food, the feedstock, that's why it's a low carbon fuel. And then of course we're trying to reduce the processing impact, the transportation impact, using low methods of fertilizing and harvesting, but reducing the whole energy input into that crop or that feedstock. But on the tailpipe side, it's approximately better. But where the benefit is with biofuels is as you reduce the amount of aromatics, if you remember your high school chemistry, the ringed compounds, if you take those out of the fuel, then you're reducing the amount of particulate being emitted out. If you have a higher cetane value, which is the way the fuel burns in an engine, if you have a higher cetane value and you're enabling a more complete combustion in the engine as biofuels do, then you're reducing the amount of tailpipe emissions, volatile organic carbons, hydrocarbons, etc. So on the tailpipe side, yes, biofuels do contribute to those other pollutants, but on the greenhouse gas side, it's over the life cycle of the feedstock.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. I think we have one up here.
You mentioned the current political climate, and there's been a lot of discussion about the scale and demand issues. Let's say policy doesn't happen. Do you see this becoming similar to organic foods versus GMOs, where there's a two-tiered market where those with the privilege and the economic prowess to be able to purchase biofuels can, and the rest of us just don't afford it? Or do you think that the current paradigm shift in the business community and in green consumerism is enough to kind of overcome those things without policy?
It's a great question. I think that what happens is it becomes more localized, and I think that what you're seeing is that manifesting today. So we rely upon a matrix of different incentives, again, whether they're very local, state level, regional level, or federal. And I would say at this moment in the cycle of things, the federal policy is at a low in terms of contribution to the revenue streams that we're receiving. But we're actually we're seeing upticks with regard to more localized programs and demand. And so I don't know that it's a haves and have-nots kind of thing. I think it becomes more about demand centers and again, the pull from whether it's the consumers themselves, the companies that are trying to deliver the solutions to their customers, et cetera. But I don't think it's the haves and have-not kind of thing like you're seeing in the GMO foods, personally.
And as you build that demand from consumers, then you're creating scale, and that'll serve to reduce the costs.
Yeah, but I mean, when there's a disincentive or a lack of opportunity, for example, at the federal level that we're seeing, that's where you have to see states and regional areas step up to the plate. And you see that in California, and you're starting to see that in Washington State. The Pacific Northwest is doing a really great job of that. I am a New Yorker, so I would love to see the Northeast take part in that too. But it's not a question of that. And we have really strong partners who weren't in place even just a few years ago, and you see that on the aviation side with airline partners and others. So I think all those things will work together. It's not a one or the other.
I just want to emphasize, look, the population density, the infrastructure that exists in the Northeast, there's no reason that we can't have substantially more biofuel and low carbon fuels being used here. Our ability to get those fuels here is certainly not easier on the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest where we're seeing these programs. It's probably easier to get it here. So it's just a matter of policy. So it really is about advocacy, education, and getting the demand here through policy.
Great. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I just wanted to point out one thing, if I could get to the slide. There you go. So we've offset this entire event. It's a carbon neutral event. Just wanted to make that clear. But on that note, thanks so much to our panelists. I think it was a fantastic discussion. Round of applause. And thanks all of you for your fantastic questions. I hope we do feel energized and inspired, and this is just part of the dialogue. So have a great afternoon and a great weekend.